As a non-poor white man, I realize that I represent the only remaining demographic group that it is perfectly fine to hate. In fact, hatred toward this group is strongly encouraged, in the name of love and harmony, of course. As such, I've been a little reluctant to delve into the rat's nest of alleged systemic discrimination in the United States. Not to worry, coming to the rescue is my favorite by the numbers guy to sort through the statistics and get to the truth. Now, BTNG has a saying. There are two types of communication, math and BS. I tried that line of reasoning on Mrs. Move the other day. I got out alive, but that's about it. But in terms of sorting through information and coming to objective and accurate conclusions, truer words were never spoken. Over to you, BTNG, and thanks as always for the non-BS.
How can we help? Very frequently, the answer to that question is, first, understand, or at least seek to understand. In this presentation, we'd like to discuss the subject of systemic discrimination in 21st century America. I'd like to focus on two areas. Number one, the gender pay gap, and number two, systemic racism, particularly with regard to Americans of African descent. First, let's discuss the gender pay gap. The observation that, on average, women in the workforce earn only 75 to 80% of what men earn. Well, the data clearly show a pronounced disparity. In fact, 75 to 80% seems to be accurate. The question we need to ask is that disparity due to discrimination, or are there other factors? For example, if, on average, women had a greater tendency to work part-time, then, of course, we would expect to see a disparity in earnings. But we wouldn't conclude that it was a function of gender discrimination. So let's make some corrections and see how they affect the disparity in income between men and women. Let's correct for education, experience, and region. In such a case, we can see that the disparity has lessened. It's interesting to note that the correction seems to have a smaller effect over time, presumably due at least partially to the fact that women are more likely to further pursue education than was the case in the 70s. But now let's further correct for occupation, industry, and unionization, basically taking into account that women on average choose lower paying careers than men. That gap has now gone from 20% or more to about 8%. That is a much smaller disparity that we might be tempted to blame on gender discrimination. But we need to note that we've only taken the low-hanging fruit into account in our calculations. Those considerations that are easily quantifiable differences: education, industry, occupation, and the like. We should note that there are still a number of psychological considerations that influence how women and men may manage their careers. For instance, women on average tend to negotiate less aggressively than men. Men tend to value money differently than women, and men tend to be more competitive than women. All factors that may influence long-term monetary compensation, all of which have nothing to do with gender bias in the workplace. Also, again, as a general rule, men tend to take higher risks than women, expecting that those risks are going to bring higher reward. All of these psychological factors need to be taken into account when looking at the gender pay gap, and all of them will tend to narrow that remaining 8% still further. We mentioned that men tend to take more risk. If successful, those risks tend to lead to higher reward. An excellent example here is the U.S. women's national soccer team, who sued their governing body, U.S. Soccer, for gender discrimination based on the perception that their compensation was not aligned to the men's national team. The judge in the case found very clearly that the women's national soccer team had a documented history of negotiations with the league, wherein the women's national soccer team had chosen a less risky guaranteed compensation contract. This lower risk choice on the part of the women's national soccer team was in no way construed to be gender bias. The judge found that it was not reasonable to blame the results of that choice on another party. In the case of the gender pay gap in our country, it is not constructive to jump to conclusions of gender bias when one notes a difference between men and women. Frequently, any disparity is a direct result of the choices that the individuals involved have made, and not some systemic discrimination built into the fabric of society. Next, we'd like to look at some data concerning Americans of African descent. Yes, I prefer either Black or Americans of African descent, because we are, all of us, first Americans, and only of our descent as a secondary consideration, if that. So let's look at some of the truly daunting challenges facing Americans of African descent. First, income inequality. By this graph, Americans of African descent earn only about 60% of their white and Asian counterparts. That's appalling. Additionally, Americans of African descent suffer poverty at about 2.5 times the rate that their white and Asian country persons. Again, that's horrible. But if you think that's bad, let's take a look at the prison population. Although blacks make up only 1/5 of the population of their white neighbors, they represent an equal fraction of the prison population, meaning blacks are incarcerated at a rate about 5 times that of whites. And since most of them are men, we might consider it more like 10 times. Well, there it is. Income inequality, poverty, and enormous disparities in incarceration rates. How can you have more ironclad evidence of systemic racism than that? Again, we need to pause for just a second and ask, are these disparities truly a function of discrimination? Or are there other factors at work that contribute to these really horrific realities? First, let's note the population of police officers and judges at the federal level. And let's note that these are pretty much in keeping with the demographics of the adult population. We might have some challenges with judges at the state level, but I think it's fair to say we aren't plagued by systemic racism, at least as it pertains to police and federal judges. As far as the prison population, I think we can agree that if Americans of African descent commit crimes at a higher rate per capita, we might expect an unequal rate of prosecution and incarceration. Here's some data on the arrests by race between 1980 and 2017. Although we've mentioned that blacks make up only 12% of the general population versus 63% for whites, i.e. about 1/5, blacks commit more like 40% of the total crimes, about twice the rate per capita. The situation gets worse for violent crime, where the number is more like 60%. But it gets truly alarming if we look at murder and manslaughter alone, where Americans of African descent commit an equal number to whites despite comprising only 20% of the relative population. We add to this the observation that the incarceration rate is weighted heavily toward violent crime. Violent crime may only represent 4% of all crime, but those incarcerated for violent crime represent 50% of the state prison population. Add to that the fact that the data show there is a strong correlation between poverty and the incarceration rate, and we would argue that white, black, Asian, or any other race, if you are poor and commit violent crimes, yes, you are dramatically more likely to end up in jail. One might be tempted to argue that income inequality itself gives rise to a higher crime rate, and that there is a vicious cycle among those two variables. Not really. There is actually a very weak correlation between income inequality and crime rate. So we would ask, as far as Americans of African descent, where is all this poverty and criminality coming from? I would argue that the disparities do not lie in the legal system, but with the inputs to the legal system. Again, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, or any other, if you come from a background of poverty and are prone to commit violent crimes, the legal system will, for the most part, mete out an equal sentence. Now we come to the real tragedy of our circumstances. we note that poverty is a very strong function of family structure. In fact, black, white, Asian, or other, if a child is born to a female-headed single-family home, that child is about 5 times more likely to live in poverty, with all the social consequences thereof. Additionally, for every 10% increase in single-parent families, there is a 17% increase in violent teen crime. Again, there is no race information in this data. Black, white, or other, with a 5x increase in poverty and an implied 9x increase in the rate of violent crimes. Children of these circumstances are at extreme risk. And now we see the tragic disparity. American children of African descent are nearly 2.5 times more likely to be born to a single-parent family, with a 2.5 times increase in female-led single-family homes. This choice, not systemic racism, but choice within the family and community itself, sets the child upon a perilous path. So what happened here? How could we go from a case where prior to 1950, less than 20% of American children of African descent were born to single-parent homes, whereas today that number is more like 75%? Yes, you guessed it, the best of intentions. In 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson brought us the War on Poverty, which, after meager gains, has done virtually nothing but consume greater resources with, in effect, nothing to show for it. The poverty rate in the United States has remained virtually unchanged for decades now. At the same time, the consequences to American families, in particular American families of African descent, has been devastating, with an explosion in single-parent familyhood, mostly female-led, has come a tsunami of poverty and consequent criminality. As one writer posed it, the question is not, is there racism? Of course there is. The question is that the singular cause for the challenges that face the black community in America? Before we conclude the causes of these differences, before we conclude racism and gender bias, we should seek to understand the driving forces behind the disparities. Only after we better understand are we in a better position to help.